sorry.
Thanks. I am not Jose Trujillo. He is my postdoc and unfortunately couldn't be here today, but just picture me with a sweet mustache and you got him. This presentation is going to cover some of our ongoing research on mitigating depredation in the Keys. I'm Ross Boucek. I work for Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. And if you haven't seen any of Aaron Adams' presentations over the last couple days, we are a science-based nonprofit that works to conserve population, uses science to conserve populations of bonefish, permit, tarpon, snook throughout the Caribbean and the habitats that support them along with the Southeast U.S. And what makes us really efficient at what we do is the co-production approach that we use that helps us get science done really quickly and also turns that science into conservation really efficiently. So this presentation is going to cover depredation. I'm going to define it as a critter that eats a fish off the line that you intended to land to keep or release, and or a fish that you intended to release or you release that gets eaten by a predator. Depredation certainly is becoming the #1 emerging issue of human-wildlife conflict in the marine environment, and that is certainly the case for the recreational and commercial fleets. And in the Florida Keys where we work, positioned in the southeast corner of the United States, is a subtropical archipelago known as a sport fishing capital of the world due to the diverse fishing opportunities that we provide. It really serves as a microcosm or an example of the complexity of this issue and how we need to kind of address it. So in the Keys, we have a diverse fishery, and nearly all of our fisheries in the inshore world are now impacted by some kind of depredation burden. All these fisheries are a little different, which may necessitate different management or mitigation actions. And to add complexity to that, the diversity of the shark communities that are doing the depredating are quite diverse, ranging from some of those species that are varying between conservation concerns, life history stage, and the movement ecology of these animals. Really, this complexity necessitates that you treat all of these fishery depredation interactions kind of on a case-by-case basis to solve the issue. So to do so, our first step was to launch a survey. We wanted to know 3 things: which fishery was impacted the most by depredation, which sharks were doing the depredating, and where was depredation the worst. We launched a survey last year and had over 200 respondents, roughly an even split between 100 for-hire fishers and 100 recreational anglers. So we're going to jump right into the results here. The first were which fishery species was most impacted. We have our fishery species on the y-axis and depredation rate on the x-axis. And how we determined impact was we asked them 2 questions. First, how much depredation are you willing to tolerate? And second, what depredation level are you experiencing for each fishery? And the idea is the difference between how much they're willing to tolerate with how much they're experiencing. That difference is what the impact was and who's getting it the worst. So tolerance, as you would expect, most people don't tolerate a ton of depredation, and there was no significant differences in tolerance across these species. When we look at perceived depredation rate, at least for these first 4 fisheries, there was no significant differences in how much depredation they were experiencing or the relative difference. But when we look at the snook and red drum fishery, we see a significant departure from the tolerance to the expected or what they're experiencing, tripling the nearest one, which was adult tarpon, meaning that these 2 fisheries are our focal fisheries for the next steps. Next, we wanted to know where depredation was occurring. So to do so, we asked our respondents to point on a map, drop 3 pins on a map where the top 3 places you're experiencing depredation are, and rank them on a scale between depredation is not bothering my fishery at all, to depredation is making fishing impossible. We standardized these by regions, added the weights to the places they identified, and then used hotspot analysis to develop heat maps to identify what places where depredation is more severe. And what you can see immediately is that though there are some hotspots, some isolated hotspots here and there, where the biggest one is this place right here, known as Flamingo, on the southern end of Everglades National Park and in the northern end of Florida Bay. And probably a reason why there's a lot of depredation here is because it's fished a lot. We have 184 hire fishers coming up from the Upper Keys that Sophie was talking about, spending a lot of their time fishing there, the 164 days per year they fish. Plus, it's very accessible for the recreational angler fleet from the Miami metropolitan area, which is the 5th largest city in America. So our next step, now we know where and what fisheries, we're to host a workshop. So we hosted a workshop with 12 for-hire fishers that ranged in experience from people that were just kind of getting into the fishery to those that have been fishing for a very, very long time. And we had 3 objectives of the workshop. Really downscale the processes of depredation that's happening in Flamingo to smaller, more tractable areas for science. Figure out what shark species are doing the depredation within the Flamingo area, and also develop some hypotheses about why Flamingo has gotten so bad with this depredation. So for the downscaling part, we asked each of these participants to fill out a map with zoomed into the Flamingo area of what places they're experiencing depredation at a very fine scale, and what shark species are doing the depredation at that spot they marked. We generated a composite map that looks like this. So the heat scores are, percent agreement by participants. And one thing that's really interesting you can see is that there's a partitioning and depredation burden in the Flamingo area where the adult bull sharks are doing the depredating toward the coast, whereas the juvenile lemon sharks are doing the depredating more in the interior part of the Florida Bay. And there was more percent agreement about what's going on with the lemon sharks being more problematic there. And I think this is a really, really cool product that we generated here because, and I think it's going to be super consistent across a lot of depredation work, that you hear that depredation's really bad in the Keys, but when you start downscaling it, you get to depredation's bad in Flamingo, then you get depredation's really just bad in this kind of chunk of Flamingo. So I bet we're going to find a lot of this where, depredation is it's bad, but it's getting, a reputation based off very, very small areas. Cool. So next steps, we have defining drivers for this conflict. So part of the workshop is trying to figure out what the guides perceived the reason why depredation was occurring. And we came up with 2 hypotheses. The first one is there are too many damn sharks. The sharks are everywhere, and the driver of this is that the shark numbers have increased to a point that it's making fishing very hard. So we distilled this to that the behaviors really haven't changed all that much for the sharks, as there's just a lot more of them. The second hypothesis was, it's really not the shark numbers haven't changed all that much. What has really changed is their behaviors and how willing they are to interact with a boat. So these are pretty cool hypotheses. One is a numerical response with opportunistic predators. The other one is the predators are kind of just changing what they do. And we can turn that into some science and derive some hypotheses based off previous data that we know about sharks and other things. So the idea, if this is a wild shark population that's just blown up in numbers, then they should still be doing wild shark things, or things that sharks do in the absence of depredation. So we can look in places like Bimini Biological Field Station, where they have done studies on lemon sharks forever, same juvenile shark situation. And what they've found is that intrinsic factors are the driver of sharks' home range size, these juvenile sharks, and more or less where the bigger the sharks get, the more area that they use. As such, they found some really strong positive correlations. If the overpopulation hypothesis is correct, we should expect a positive correlation between the body length of the sharks that we would be tracking and their home range size. And this is like in Flamingo, if you can see it, there's like 1 billion sharks. The second hypothesis, the behavioral hypothesis. And to look at this, we had to pull from the literature that looks at provisioning, human provisioning of wildlife, and also predictable anthropogenic food subsidies. And the prediction usually made there is the more predictable this food subsidy is, the more subsidy we provide, the more food we provide these wild animals, their home range tends to shrink around that. And this is a good example that looked at possums and raccoons and their overlap with the urban environment. And they found that there was a negative correlation between how little or how much they overlapped with the urban environment and how accessible trash cans were to their home range size, where the more they were in the urban environment, the more they relied on trash, and the less they had to move. So we can apply this to our lemon sharks. We know that we can just assume that the depredation hotspots, represented here in brown, are basically the anthropogenic trash cans, and the idea that the more the sharks' home ranges overlap with those trash cans, the less their home range is. So essentially sharks being little trash raccoons. So 2 hypotheses that that would provide support for the overpopulation hypothesis or the behavior hypothesis. Cool. So let's get into data. Okay, methods. There's actually other couple components to these study also very cool with similar hypotheses. But for this part, we measured their home range sizes over the last year using two methods: acoustic telemetry. 56 sharks were tagged, and 19 receivers were deployed in Flamingo. Coupled that with 4 satellite tags. All right, results. So again, our first hypothesis was that intrinsic factors, primarily total length, should predict the home range size of these sharks. And for home range size, we use core use area, which is a metric that it's in the Silva et al. 2022 paper. And this here, just to show you what how our body length range compared to the Bimini range, is represented here with this red line. So what we find here when we look at the relationship between total length and core use area is a very weak, I would say ecologically insignificant relationship between total length and core use area. So cool. Big spread in the length of sharks, so we're not like biasing there, but very interesting. The next thing we looked at is this trash raccoon hypothesis, where the more they overlap with our depredation hotspots, the core use area should shrink. So over here is percent overlap with depredation hotspot, and then the core use area here. And what we find here is really cool. We find this really strong negative correlation between core use area size and percent overlap with a depredation hotspot. So another interesting factor about this too, in the development of this correlation, you can see we have this really strong, really big range in overlaps between sharks that are really hardly ever using it and using a ton of area, versus some sharks like these here that just don't use, just basically never leave the hotspot. So from a management perspective, and you can also see there's some clustering happening, which is also really cool. But from a management perspective, we can't just open up the harvest on these sharks, because you're subjecting a lot of these sharks that aren't just doing normal shark stuff to problems. But if you can target these guys, you can do some cool stuff. So some stats, intrinsic factors didn't predict anything. If we want to see what these look like from the satellite telemetry perspective, here as a left is one of these high hotspot overlap sharks here. And essentially it just does donuts or laps all day and every day around this depredation hotspot known as Murray Key. And on the second side is kind of more of this wild shark. It's using a diverse type of habitats. And it's also really cool. It's like responding to environmental drivers where that shark is just not. So we really, and we run these by the fishing guides too, and oh man, that is so cool when they're over here, there's big mullet mud over here, here's this trout mud. So they agree that this is reflecting what sharks should be doing. So it's pretty sweet. Well, anyways, so that's kind of the movement part of this work, but nonetheless, we were able to downscale depredation as a problem in a key, all over the Keys, to really a single fishery, to a single depredator species, and to a pretty small area. And we're finding more support that this is more of a behaviorally driven phenomenon than it is or process, I should say, than it is a kind of numerical or shark recovery demographic, however you want to say it, response. So last but not least, this is the first chapter of this work. This project is going to end in the next couple months. But we get to the next exciting part, where we get to really apply the BTT approach to the next steps of science and really develop and test some mitigation strategies. So if you think this talk was cool and this approach is cool, we'll be hiring a new postdoc here in the next couple months. So keep an eye out for an ad, and let me know if you're interested. So with that, I will take any questions. Yes, sir. Have any of these results been implemented? The results necessarily haven't been, but just people have been starting to shift away from fishing those areas as much. But the issue is we have this recreational fleet that comes from Miami that is driven by different things than the for-hire fleet that has a little stronger conservation ethic. Where if you only fish 2 days every month, you may try to fish through the sharks more frequently than somebody who's fishing every day. So. In terms of changing behavior, particularly here, it's going to be so difficult because you have these diverse fleets. And not to say you can't do it, but it's certainly something we can think that but no results have really, no one's changed their behavior quite yet. Yes, ma'am.
It's a really cool study. Thank you so much. And it's so cool to see telemetry being used to answer very specific questions like this. There was some similar work that was done with stingrays provision with the Bahamas, and they showed that it was really like these large females that kind of tended to dominate those spots. I mean, given that this is such an individualistic response, do you think that it's something similar there, or do you think there's other kinds of intrinsic factors in the individuals that are making them prone to this sort of depredation behavior?
That's a good question. For the intrinsic, our intrinsic factors have not just predicted anything at all. The sharks are equally the same in condition. They're equally, there's no body length comparison. So what makes a shark want to do this? I don't know. I know there's some nurse shark studies in the urban environment where they just kind of do urban stuff. So it's probably I don't know if anyone's got any ideas. I'd love to hear them. But yeah. Yes, sir.
Cool. Yeah, awesome talk. I think depredation issues are happening in South Africa. They definitely patterns seem to show around urban centres or high fish areas are definitely where it's happening. There's obviously this sort of talk about too many sharks in the water now, but do you not think maybe MPAs, marine protected areas, have a role in trying to disprove the theory of high shark abundances? Because in those areas, or at least it's our MPAs, where we're really fishing for whatever purposes, we don't get any depredation events at all, even though we know from surveys shark numbers are 10 times higher than they are outside. But we're not getting depredation. So the evidence is there that it is habituation and it is a learned behavior from individuals in the area and not just the increasing abundance of sharks that a lot of anglers are kind of taught or suggesting.
Yeah, now that's a good question. How does MPAs function in mitigating this conflict? So, we got to think about this in a couple different fronts. First, is this a sustainability concern for snook and redfish? And I think, yes, it is. That's a productivity center for them where an MPA could help. Now, the question is, what are the sharks going to do, particularly these habituated ones, when you take away that stimuli? Are they just going to leave the MPA and find the next one? Or you're also shutting down a relatively large area, too, that's being fished by a lot of people. So there's going to be some economic ramifications and social ramifications. So I think there's a place for MPAs in this. And one thing I didn't show is the snook spawning aggregation site that the catchment gets sucked into for Flamingo is just covered up in depredation. And I think a time area closure there would probably have much more benefit overall to the snook population than a larger closure to Flamingo. But nonetheless, with more data, we could probably get pretty darn good at nailing in, some pretty specific time area closures based off temperature and some of these other external factors that seem to escalate or de-escalate the conflict. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One more question. Yes, sir.
I was just curious if you looked into how they handle terrestrial predators like bears in national parks, and that they get in campgrounds, they get food, and then they become a problem. Is there something you can learn from that?
We've looked into it a little bit. Florida's tendency is to go straight to killing them. So, our managers are ready to conservate the hell out of these sharks. And I know there's some sea lions work that I've heard where they had to euthanize these sea lions that were going to the dams because there was nothing else that was working. So, yeah.
Just to add to that, where we are at, pinnipeds are a major source of depredation on salmonids. And I know from personal experience, they learn quickly. And so in our area, pinnipeds will react to you turning a downright run. And they know where to go. So if you're trying to avoid them, it's hard to do. They follow boats. Whales, same thing up in Alaska. So I was looking at this thinking, boy, the sharks have learned. It's hard to compare a shark to a pinniped, I would think. But boy, in our area, depredation is a learned behavior. And then it's passed on to other members in the colony and explodes pretty rapidly based on learning.
Yeah. I wonder how much learning, the social dimension of sharks are. I'm sure some other shark people know better than I do, but yeah, it's incredible. And this system and other systems in the Keys, a common way to get a shark away from your boat was to stab them with a pole. And now in the last couple years, if a shark is following your boat and you lift up the pole, the sharks move just far enough away from the boat to get out of the pole's range. And it's amazing to see how that behavior's changed, at least in some of these other spots. So yeah, they're smarter than we give them credit for. And I mean, 100 years of serial overfishing will probably leave us with the smartest sharks. Yeah. But thank you so much for attending my talk and skipping out on War and Potts. So I appreciate that.